Imagine stepping into a world where the only barrier between life and death is a thin wall of buffalo hide, flapping in the icy wind of a frozen North American winter. A world where every breath you take crystallizes before your eyes, where the ground is iron-hard beneath your feet, and the sun hangs low and dim like a dying ember in a pale sky. A world where the temperature doesn't just sting your skin, it crawls inside your bones, freezes your eyelashes, and tries to crush your lungs with every inhale. Yet in this same world, entire communities not only survived, but thrived, laughed, cooked, told stories, raised children, held ceremonies, and dreamed beneath the shimmering curtain of the Northern Lights. You're about to enter that world, the world of the Native American peoples of the Great Plains, and the astonishing engineering, skill, and resilience behind the teepee, a home that could stand strong at -30 degrees Celsius, resist brutal winds. Stay warm inside without trapping smoke, and be packed up within an hour to follow migrating herds across thousands of miles. The snow that blanketed the plains was not soft or gentle. In winters like these it formed jagged crusts that could slice through moccasins. The bison herds migrated farther south, and every tribe had to move with them or risk starvation. But movement meant packing everything: tools, hides, food, weapons, clothing, and of course the teepee itself. And the teepee was not just a shelter. It was a way of life, a symbol, a science, a spiritual geometry that connected earth and sky. Each pole represented something. Each knot had a meaning. Each hide panel had been scraped, stretched, dried, sewn, and smoked with the hands of mothers and daughters across generations. Now imagine a young Lakota woman named Wiana, her breath fogging as she works at dawn. She presses her bare palm gently against the inner wall of the teepee. Despite the blizzard raging outside, the hide is warm. The fire crackles in the center, its smoke spiraling upward toward the smoke hole, the heart of the structure. The poles rise like ribs around her, forming a cone that is both fragile and indestructible. She listens to the wind howling like a living creature just beyond the thin barrier, but inside she feels a cocoon of peace. A newborn baby sleeps beside her grandmother, wrapped in a rabbit-skin blanket, tiny chest rising and falling. Outside, the world wants to kill them. Inside, the teepee says, "Not today!" The teepee was genius long before modern engineers ever existed. It breathed. It flexed. It expanded and contracted with temperature. When snow piled against its sides, it did not collapse. When wind struck, it bent and sprang back. When smoke rose, it escaped without letting in too much cold. The entire structure was a negotiation with nature, not a battle. And survival in -22 degrees Fahrenheit demanded this level of harmony. There was no other choice. The poles, the skeleton of the teepee, were carefully selected. Lodgepole pine, tall and slender, straight as an arrow. They were harvested in summer, dried for weeks until the sap hardened, then carried hundreds of miles on journeys that would terrify modern campers. Each pole could be up to 20 feet long, yet a single horse could drag 20 or more. These poles were not simply wood. They were memory. A family kept the same poles for years, sometimes decades. They knew each bend, each scar. Children grew up recognizing them like old friends. When a pole finally broke after years of windstorms and migrations, it was laid to rest with ceremony, because even a piece of wood deserved honor when it had sheltered lives. Buffalo hides formed the outer skin. One hide was not enough, not even close. A large winter teepee might require 12, 14, even 20 hides. Picture that, 20 wild buffalo, each weighing up to a ton, thundering across a prairie. Every hide in a teepee represented a hunt, a chase, a battle, a life taken and a life sustained. When the hides were stitched together, it wasn't just sewing. It was remembering. Women gathered around the hide in daylight, using bone needles and sinew thread extracted from the strongest tendons. They sang old songs. They laughed. They taught young girls how to pull the sinew through without tearing the hide. They told stories about ancestors who had survived blizzards far worse than this one. The doorway always faced east. Always. To greet the sunrise. to remind everyone inside that no matter how cold the night, a new day was guaranteed. And this wasn't superstition, it was strategic. The west carried wind. The east carried warmth. Opening the teepee toward the east reduced drafts and brought in gentle morning light. Everything had a purpose. Inside the teepee at minus 30 degrees Celsius, a miracle happened daily. Warmth did not escape. Fire would burn cleanly because the smoke hole at the top could be widened or narrowed with two long exterior poles. If the wind shifted, the smoke flaps shifted too. A teepee was constantly adjusting, like a bird's wings in a storm. Even the floor was insulated. People layered buffalo robes, dry grass, pine boughs, or woven mats to create a warm and springy surface. Lying down inside felt like sleeping on the forest floor. Families slept with heads toward the outer wall and feet toward the fire. Children were placed closest to the center for maximum warmth. The elderly slept farther from drafts. Tools hung from the poles. Herbs dried above the fire. A pot of soup simmered all night, thick with bison bone marrow, turning the whole teepee into a living, breathing kitchen. But winter wasn't only about surviving. It was a season of storytelling. As winds whipped across the plains outside, the inside of the teepee glowed orange with firelight. Shadows of the poles stretched like giants up the curved walls. Elders narrated stories of creation, heroes, tricksters, great hunts, great loves, and great losses. Children listened with wide eyes, wrapped in fur blankets. Every word warmed the air like another ember added to the fire. There was no boredom, even in months of snow. Women sewed. Men fletched arrows. Children played quiet games with carved bone toys. Old men smoked pipes and debated tribal decisions. Teens whispered secrets behind hides, wondering about adulthood, marriages, and hunts to come. The teepee was not just shelter, it was a winter world. But outside, the real test continued. Temperatures could plunge lower. Sometimes minus 35 degrees Celsius, sometimes beyond. The wind could turn deadly in minutes. A person caught far from shelter could freeze before sunset. Snowdrifts could bury a horse. But the teepee stood tall, like a small mountain of warmth in a white, endless land. Travelers could spot its smoke from miles away, a thin, wavering signal of life in a frozen world. And yet, despite the brutal cold, there was beauty. Northern lights shimmered like falling curtains of green fire. Ice crystals glittered across the prairie like a sea of diamonds. Wolves howled in the distance, haunting yet majestic. The stars were sharp enough to cut your heart open. Winter on the plains was terrifying, yes, but it was also unforgettable. The tribes learned to thrive by understanding every whisper of the land. They knew how snow packed, how wind curled over hills, how buffalo migrated, how the teepee's poles should lean depending on the season. A winter teepee was pitched differently from a summer one, lower, tighter, angled against the strongest winds. Sometimes hides were doubled. Sometimes a windbreak of snow or brush was built around it. Nothing was random. Everything was survival. But even the strongest teepee trembled when the great storms came. Picture a night like this. Winds screaming like lost spirits, snow slamming against the hides so violently that the whole structure shudders. Wiana wakes up and feels a draft. The fire sputters. Her father rises immediately, because a teepee must be cared for like a living being. He adjusts the smoke flaps. He checks the poles. He tightens the lashing rope at the peak. Every second outside is agony. The cold bites his face, pierces through his leggings, numbs his fingers instantly. But he works fast. He knows this storm could last days. Strength now means survival later. He comes back inside shaking, but the fire warms him slowly. The family gathers closer. They share a bowl of hot marrow soup. Even the baby gets a tiny sip on its lips. This is winter, harsh, punishing, beautiful, sacred. The teepee held against storms that would level modern tents in seconds. Its conical shape rejected wind. Its angled sides shed snow. Its poles absorbed shock like springs. And inside, As long as the fire burned, life continued. At -30 degrees Celsius, a teepee didn't just protect, it created culture. It was home, temple, classroom, bedroom, kitchen, hospital. Inside teepees, children were born. Warriors died. Elders passed down knowledge. Weddings were held. Songs were taught. Food was shared. Dreams were woven. A frozen world outside. A warm world inside. This was the genius of the teepee. The blizzard outside had swallowed the entire world. No horizon. No sky. No earth. Just white, an endless roaring, swirling white that erased everything it touched. In conditions like this, even the bravest hunters refused to travel. A single wrong step could mean falling into a drift deeper than a man's height, or wandering in circles until the cold claimed you silently. But inside the teepee, the fire burned strong. Sparks rose like tiny spirits, casting dancing shapes on the hide walls. Children watched them with wonder, imagining those sparks as ancestors visiting during the storm. Wiana's grandfather, a man whose face was lined with decades of winters, began telling one of the oldest stories, how the first teepee was taught to humans by a trickster who stole design secrets from the animals. According to the tale, the trickster had watched a family of bears build a winter den perfectly angled to resist snow. He watched how birds nested in cones, how wolves dug hollows, how bison huddled in circles to block the wind. Piece by piece, he studied nature's architecture until he assembled a brilliant idea. He taught the people to arrange poles like a rising sun, to wrap hides like a second skin, and to leave a gap at the top so smoke could escape but warmth couldn't. Then he vanished into the hills, laughing, promising that every winter would test the humans to see if they remembered his teachings. The children giggled at the story, even though they'd heard it 100 times. But tonight it felt more real. Outside, the storm sounded like the trickster himself, testing the people once again. Wiana's father added extra firewood. The logs hissed as pockets of sap boiled and burst, filling the air with a sharp, resinous scent. The warmth spread outward like a blanket. Even the outer walls of the teepee softened and glowed with reflected heat. In a place where the outside air could kill, the ability to control warmth was more precious than any treasure. The fire wasn't just a light, it was life distilled into flame. But fire alone wasn't enough to survive nights like this. The teepee did its own magic. The cone shape created convection currents. Cold air sank toward the doorway while warm air rose along the walls. The buffalo hides, thick and dense, held heat the way a living animal does. Even the stitching mattered, tight enough to block drafts, loose enough to allow the hide to expand naturally in the cold without tearing. When temperatures dropped to extremes, families added an inner lining of lighter hides. This lining created an air pocket, like the insulation in modern homes. The result was astonishing. Even at -30 degrees Celsius outside, inside temperatures could rise above freezing, sometimes even becoming comfortably warm. Imagine waking up in such a world. The fire reduced to glowing embers. Outside the storm still raging. Inside the teepee, the air alive with breath and warmth. Wiana stretches, wrapping a robe tightly around her shoulders. Her mother is already awake, gently shaking a small deer-hide bag to separate frozen grains of corn. Breakfast must be prepared long before daylight. She places a pot on the rekindled fire, melting snow first, then adding preserved berries, corn, and a handful of dried bison meat. This stew will be the only real meal until evening. Food in winter wasn't eaten for pleasure, it was fuel. Every task was essential. A mistake could cost a life. When the fire grows too hot, the smoke hole must open wider or the teepee fills with choking fumes. If it's opened too much, precious warmth escapes. Every second is a balancing act. Outside the storm begins to calm, though the wind still moans across the plains. Wiana's father prepares to go out. He wraps himself in multiple layers, leggings of tan buckskin, a fur-lined robe, moccasins insulated with dry grass. Clothing wasn't random. Each layer was chosen for a reason. Buckskin breathed better than modern fabrics. Fur captured warmth. Grass trapped air like modern insulation. Even the boots were designed to flex and move silently, preventing sweat from freezing around the toes. He pushes aside the heavy door flap, made from thick hide and weighted with bone to keep it sealed, and steps into a world transformed. Snow drifts tower taller than a man. The wind has carved ridges and waves in the snow, making the entire plains look like a frozen ocean. His breath freezes instantly in the air. The cold strikes him like a solid object. But he walks on, checking the perimeter, ensuring no snow has piled dangerously against the teepee. Too much weight could press inward and weaken the poles. Farther from camp, hunters are preparing to track bison. Even in this cold, the people must follow the herds. Meat, hide, bone, sinew, everything their lives depend on, comes from the bison. A single animal can feed a family for weeks. But hunting in -30°C is a trial few can imagine. Fingers numb even through gloves. Breath stings. Eyelashes freeze together. Snow blinds. But the hunters press forward because they know the land will not forgive weakness. Back in the teepee, Wiana tends to the fire. She places small sticks around the embers in a circle, watching carefully as tiny flames lick upward. Fire building is a skill every child learns early. Not just how to start fire, but how to maintain it efficiently. Wood is precious. They cannot waste even a handful. The teepee's entire microclimate depends on steady heat. Too much fire creates condensation that freezes inside the hide. Too little fire lets frost creep inside, turning the air icy. The walls of the teepee tell the truth every morning. A well-kept fire leaves them supple. A weak fire leaves them stiff and frosted. As the day brightens, faint sunlight pushes through the smoke hole, casting pale beams across the interior. The storm has passed completely now. The plains stretch endlessly white, glittering under a sky so blue it hurts. Children run outside immediately, sinking almost to their knees in snow. They laugh, throw handfuls of powder at each other, try to catch snowflakes on their tongues. Their joy seems impossible in such cold, but that is the resilience of a people who have known winter from the beginning. Later, the entire community gathers to reinforce the camp. Women shake snow off outer hides. Men check the structural tension of the poles. Elders offer small prayers of thanks for surviving another storm. Winter on the plains wasn't just a season, it was a teacher. It punished carelessness, rewarded preparation, and demanded respect. But survival wasn't enough. Life had to be lived too. As evening approaches, preparations begin for a winter storytelling circle. The fire inside each teepee burns bright again, its smoke rising in slender spirals. When darkness falls early, as it always did in these months, the world outside disappears entirely. Only the glowing teepees remain, scattered across the snow like warm stars fallen from the sky. Inside Wiana's teepee, the family gathers closer. The fire dances. Her grandfather begins another story, this one about a young warrior who once survived a 40-day blizzard with nothing but a single robe and his prayers. His tale wasn't a myth, it was a lesson. Every story carried knowledge disguised as entertainment. How to track animals in deep snow. How to build a temporary shelter. How to communicate with wind patterns. How to understand when the cold is about to grow deadly. These lessons soaked into the children's minds long before they ever faced them. Hours pass in warmth and laughter. Outside, wolves howl again, but this time the sound is distant, calm, almost like a chorus. Wiana lies down beside the fire, pulling a robe over herself. Her parents whisper quietly. Her grandmother hums a song older than any memory. Snow taps gently against the hide walls, but the teepee is strong. It breathes in the night. It watches over the sleeping family. It holds ancient knowledge in every pole and every stitch. The world outside is frozen. Inside, life moves like a warm river. And this was how the Native American people built, lived, dreamed, survived, and thrived in teepees, even in the unforgiving embrace of -30°C winters. Night settled over the plains like a vast black blanket, pierced only by the moon's cold silver glow. The teepee village looked like a cluster of glowing hearts scattered across the white earth, each one alive, each one holding a world of its own. Inside Wiana's teepee, the fire was burning low, casting soft orange halos on the hides. Outside, the temperature had dropped again, maybe to -32 degrees Celsius now, the kind of cold that didn't just sting, it cracked. It cracked wood, cracked skin, cracked the world into silence. Yet inside, the air still carried the warmth of bodies, breath, stories, and life. Wiana woke in the middle of the night to the sound of her grandmother whispering a prayer. It wasn't fear, it was habit. Old ones often woke to tend the fire, to thank the spirits, to check the smoke hole, to ensure the family stayed safe. The teepee was a living thing, and like a living thing, it needed tending through the night. Her grandmother moved quietly, carefully adjusting a log onto the coals. Sparks leapt upward like tiny stars. A faint draft slipped in as the flaps stirred, and Wiana's grandmother immediately pulled her robe tighter, not wanting even a thread of cold to seep in. At -30 degrees Celsius, even a momentary draft could turn breath into fog, fog into frost, and frost into little crystals that spread across the hides like white vines. Wiana watched her grandmother for a moment, admiring the quiet strength in her slow, deliberate motions. Every winter, people like her held families together. Not the warriors or hunters, but the quiet watchers, the firekeepers, the ones who knew how to keep warmth alive when the world outside wanted to steal every last bit of it. She drifted back to sleep, comforted by the knowledge that the teepee was warm, alive, breathing. By morning, the cold had tightened its grip even more. When her father stepped outside, the air attacked his exposed skin like a swarm of needles. His breath erupted from his mouth in a thick cloud. The snow under his feet squeaked, a sound that only came from extreme cold. He checked the horizon, scanning for bison tracks or signs of returning hunters. Far in the distance, tiny dark shapes moved against the frozen plains. The hunters were coming home. The tribe gathered near the edge of the camp. Children jumped excitedly, not feeling the cold in their excitement. Dogs barked, circling around. The hunters staggered in, exhausted but triumphant. They carried with them the promise of life: meat, hides, sinew, fat. Every part of the bison was treasure. Nothing would be wasted. Women rushed to prepare the butchering area, spreading mats made from willow. Fresh hides were brought into the warming sunlight to be scraped clean. The smell of fresh meat mixed with the crisp winter air. The snow beneath the carcass began to darken, but no one flinched. This was life. This was survival. This was gratitude. Inside the teepee, Wiana and the older women began preparing tools, scrapers made from bone, stone knives sharpened the night before. The scraping process wasn't just work, it was connection. Each stroke of the scraper brought the hide closer to becoming clothing, shelter, rope, or lining. Every woman knew how many hides her family needed to survive the winter. Thick winter robes soaked in smoke and grease to resist moisture. New boot liners because old ones would freeze stiff. Extra hide panels to reinforce the teepee. The teepee itself needed attention. The storm had passed, but storms were never far apart in these frozen lands. Men checked the pole angles, making small adjustments. Women layered additional robes inside the lower half of the teepee, creating a thicker insulation zone. Children fetched snow to melt for water, and even that was a chore. Snow had to be collected from clean drifts, untouched by dogs or wind-blown dust. As midday arrived, the sky brightened to a pale blue. Sunlight glittered on the snow like a sea of diamonds stretching infinitely in every direction. The cold still hung heavy, but the brightness lifted everyone's spirits. Winter was not just hardship, it held its own kind of beauty. Later that afternoon, smoke began to rise from every teepee as families cooked the fresh bison meat. The smell spread through the camp, warm and rich, carried by the wind. Even the oldest members lifted their heads to inhale deeply. A warm meal was a gift from the earth, a moment of peace in a land that rarely offered any. Inside Wiana's teepee, the stew bubbled, thick chunks of bison meat, marrow, dried berries, and wild herbs. The steam filled the air, turning the cold tip of the smoke hole into a glowing, foggy chimney. Everyone ate slowly, savoring every bite. Food in winter tasted like survival itself. As evening fell again, the hunters spoke of what they saw: frozen lakes covered in thick ice, herds moving southward in slow waves, storms gathering in distant clouds. Their words were warnings, lessons, omens. The tribe listened, weighing each detail. Winter decisions had to be precise. A wrong guess could cost lives. That night, the elders called a council inside the largest teepee. It was built wider, taller, reinforced with extra poles. Inside it, dozens of people could sit around a central fire. The flames cast long shadows on the walls, making the elders appear larger, almost mythic. They discussed moving the camp farther south before the next storm arrived. But moving meant dismantling every teepee, rolling the hides, binding the poles, packing everything onto horses and sleds. It was a tremendous effort. Outside, the wind whispered across the plains like a warning voice. Inside, the council fire cracked and sparked. Decisions had to be made quickly. Meanwhile, in her own teepee, Wiana was learning one of the most important winter lessons: how to roll a teepee. Her mother showed her how to fold the hides carefully, aligning the seams so they didn't crack. How to tie them with sinew cords strong enough to withstand travel. How to wrap the lashing rope around the poles without allowing them to rub and splinter. These were not just chores, they were teachings passed through generations. "You must know this," her mother said softly. "Someday you will have your own teepee to care for." Wiana's fingers were cold, but the work warmed her spirit. She imagined the future, the hunts, the migrations, the storms she would survive, the children she might comfort through freezing nights. The teepee was not just shelter. It was legacy. Outside, the moon lifted above the snow, reflecting light that made everything gleam like silver. The night was still, quiet, sharp. Wolves moved like shadows in the distance. But the village glowed with life. Inside the teepees, the fires burned. Families whispered. Children slept. Elders prayed. Snow fell silently outside, covering the world again in white. And still the teepees stood strong, warm islands in a frozen sea. Islands of survival. Islands of memory. Islands of a people who learned not just to withstand winter, but to live fully inside it. The night deepened again, but this time the cold moved differently, slow, creeping, almost intelligent. It slithered across the plains like a silent predator, sliding between snowdrifts, slipping through the cracks of the world. Even the wolves had stopped howling, as if they sensed something in the air that humans could not name. Yet inside the teepee, warmth held firm, battling the darkness inch by inch. Wiana lay awake, listening to the slow breathing of her family. The fire was steady now, a glowing heart in the middle of the circle of sleeping robes. She watched the flames dance, shifting from gold to orange to deep red, as if telling stories of their own. She could almost hear the crackling whispers, the sound of wood spirits escaping, the memory of forests consumed in the fire's hunger. Suddenly, a small gust rattled the hide near her head. It wasn't strong, but it was sharp, sharp in a way only death-cold wind could be. Her grandmother's eyes snapped open instantly. That was the instinct of someone who had lived 60 winters on the plains. A single cold draft, left unattended, could lower the internal temperature of the teepee so fast that water skins froze solid overnight. Her grandmother stood, steady despite age, and checked the door flap. The wind had shifted direction. During storms, the flap would always face away from the wind, but now the weather was turning again. The flap had to be reinforced. She tied it tighter with rawhide cords, pulling until her old hands trembled. When she finished, she touched the hide gently, whispering a thank you prayer, not to the wind, not to the cold, but to the teepee itself. To its strength. To its patience. To its willingness to shelter them. Wiana drifted back to sleep as her grandmother returned to her robe. But outside, the cold continued creeping. By morning, the entire village woke to an unexpected sight. The sky was a pale yellow-gray, a color that meant only one thing: a ground blizzard. Even without falling snow, the wind could scrape the surface, lifting old snow into the air until the entire world vanished into a white fog. Visibility might drop to arm's length. People could step outside and disappear in seconds. The elders made an immediate decision: no one leaves the village today. The children groaned, the hunters sighed, the women looked relieved, and the dogs barked wildly at the unnatural smell of the wind. But the rule was absolute. For the Plains tribes, a ground blizzard was more dangerous than a new snowfall. It carried old ice crystals that cut through skin like tiny knives. Inside the teepee, the family prepared for another long confinement. Wiana's mother began by teaching her something new: how to prepare fire-starting bundles for emergencies. She showed her how to take dried grass, knot it carefully, wrap it with shredded bark, and hold it inside a pouch lined with hide dusted in ash. These bundles could save lives if hunters got stranded. Even damp wood could ignite with these carefully packed sparks. "Winter doesn't forgive those who guess," her mother said quietly. "It only forgives those who prepare." Hours passed. Outside, the wind screamed like a wild spirit. Snow crystals slashed against the teepee walls, slicing tiny grooves into the hides. But the structure held. The poles bent with the wind, but they did not break. That was the brilliance of the conical shape. It guided winter's fury upward, deflecting pressure instead of resisting it. Around midday, the wind grew louder. Something thudded against the teepee wall, once, then again. The dogs began barking frantically. Wiana peeked out through a small seam and gasped. The snow was moving horizontally, not falling. It raced across the ground like a living thing, swirling in violent spirals, curling around the teepees, trying to force its way in. The world outside was one color now: white. No horizon, no shapes, nothing but shifting, churning white. Inside the teepee, the fire flickered uncertainly, responding to the pressure changes outside. The smoke hole flapped violently, letting bursts of cold air drop inside like icy claws. Her father stood up, tightening the smoke flap from inside, adjusting the angle of the sticks that held it open. It was a delicate balance: too tight, and the smoke had nowhere to go; too loose, and the cold would invade. For a moment, the smoke thickened, turning the air gray. Everyone coughed. The children's eyes watered. But her father adjusted it again, angled it perfectly, and the smoke rose cleanly once more. Even breathing indoors was a battle in winter. As afternoon stretched into evening, the storm showed no sign of ending. The wind roared like something alive, something furious. Snow piled up against the sides of the teepee, slowly creeping upward like a rising tide. Too much snow could collapse the poles, everyone knew that. So every hour, someone had to crawl outside, clear the drifts, and return quickly before becoming disoriented or frozen. Tonight, it was the men's job. Wiana's father wrapped a robe around himself, pulled the hood tight, and stepped outside into the chaos. The wind almost knocked him sideways. Snow particles stung his face. He bent low, crawling along the pole line so he wouldn't lose direction, and brushed snow away from the base of the teepee. His hands grew numb almost instantly. The cold bit through the hide robe like teeth. But he worked quickly, scraping the snow aside with steady, practiced motions. Inside, the family waited, silent. Minutes passed. Then more. The storm howled. Still no sign of him. Wiana's mother went to the flap, lifting it just enough to call his name. Her voice vanished in the wind. The sound dissolved instantly, swallowed by the storm. Panic tightened her face, but she forced herself to stay calm. Panic cost lives. Waiting saved them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a shape appeared, stumbling, crawling, covered in white frost like a statue rising from snow. Her father collapsed inside, shaking violently. The cold had sunk deep into him. His eyelashes were frozen together. His hands were white, bloodless, stiff. Wiana rushed forward with a robe. Her grandmother grabbed a warm stone from the fire pit, heated precisely to the right temperature, and pressed it wrapped inside cloth against his hands, then his chest, then his feet. They didn't warm him too fast. That was dangerous. Warming a frozen body needed patience, skill, and prayer. Slowly, very slowly, life returned to his fingers. He whispered, voice cracking. The snow, it's rising higher. We need more poles. The storm, it's not finished. Fear flickered through the family's eyes, but they nodded. They would be ready. As night fell again, the storm only intensified. The teepee creaked but held its ground. It had endured more winters than some of the children had lived. Every pole had a memory. Every hide held scars from past storms. It was more than shelter, it was a warrior. Inside, the fire glowed brighter. The family huddled closer. Wiana listened to her grandmother hum an ancient melody, steady, calm, unafraid. The kind of tune that reminded everyone that winter might roar, might bite, might try to break them. But it had never succeeded. Not once. Not in the thousands of years that people had walked these plains. And as long as the teepee stood, warm, breathing, powerful, they would stand too. And as the storm screeched across the frozen plains, the people inside the towering teepee kept doing what their ancestors had done for centuries, turning the deadliest cold into something survivable. The wind howled like a wounded animal outside, pushing snow across the camp so thickly that a person couldn't see their own hands. But inside, the buffalo hide walls flexed, groaned, and yet held firm, like a living creature shielding its family from the rage of winter. Children slept inside fur-lined blankets, their breath little clouds floating in the dim, orange glow. Elders whispered prayers beside the fire, remembering the ancient stories of colder winters, harsher storms, and the incredible resilience that allowed their people to stand where others would have fallen. The cold outside never begged for mercy, and the native people never expected mercy from it. They simply learned to answer it, shape their lives around it, and master it. The teepee was not just a shelter, it was a weapon forged against the cold. A tool so perfect in design that even at -30 degrees Celsius, it acted like a small, breathing world of warmth. Imagine spending nights where even the stars seemed frozen, where each breath felt sharp enough to cut the throat, yet inside the teepee families talked softly, cooked fresh meat, repaired clothing, mended tools, and lived not in fear, but in harmony. Snow slapped against the slanted walls, sliding down like white ghosts trying to enter. But the slanted angle wasn't an accident. Every detail of the teepee had a reason. The poles leaned in a cone so the wind would rush around it instead of hitting like a wall. The hides overlapped in layers, trapping heat but letting smoke escape through the adjustable smoke flaps. When the fire crackled, bits of heat climbed upward and disappeared into the night, and every tribal member knew how to read the direction of the wind just by watching how the smoke behaved. If the smoke hesitated, they opened the flaps wider. If the wind pushed snow in, they tightened the hides. They didn't fight nature, they spoke its language. Outside, the dogs huddled together for warmth, their breaths steaming. Some scratched at the snow to make little nests. Others lay pressed up against the lower part of the teepee, sensing the warmth leaking through tiny gaps. The bitter cold never scared them. They were born into it, shaped by it, part of it. Farther away, the horses stood near windbreaks of woven willow branches, steam rising from their bodies, their hooves buried in snow. Warriors checked on them periodically, touching their warm noses, brushing frost from their manes, whispering calming words as the storm screamed overhead. Inside the teepee, the fire was like a heartbeat. Every crackle felt alive. The floor was covered with thick buffalo robes, layered so no cold could crawl through the earth. The people slept low, close to the floor, where the warmest air collected. A small pot of snow melted slowly near the fire, and the scent of meat broth drifted upward, mixing with the aroma of smoke and hide, a smell that meant survival, comfort, and home. One elder told a story softly, his voice steady despite the storm outside. He spoke of a time when buffalo herds were so large that the ground trembled under their hooves. He spoke of warriors who rode for days through blizzards so fierce that even wolves turned away. The children listened, wide-eyed, the firelight reflecting in their pupils. To them, these stories weren't legends, they were instructions, lessons, maps to survival. That's how knowledge passed down, not from books, but from breath to breath, fire to fire, winter to winter. A woman near the fire stitched a pair of winter moccasins using sinew thread, her hands steady despite the cold. She worked quickly, with skill practiced since childhood. Every stitch mattered. Every fold meant life in the deep cold. Across from her, another woman braided a rope using strips of rawhide, the rhythm of her movements calm and steady. Around them, the teepee breathed like a sleeping animal, warm, protective, strong. The storm outside changed its tone, the wind no longer shrieking but humming. Snow piled halfway up the sides now, insulating it even further. The cold had become an unexpected helper. A frozen blanket hugging the teepee walls. For the native people, winter wasn't just an enemy. It could be an ally if you knew how to use it. The men at the entrance checked the hide door flap again, making sure it was tightly secured. No unnecessary gap. No wasted heat. They knew the cold punished mistakes. Hours passed. Or maybe minutes. Time inside the teepee always felt different during storms. The fire dimmed, then brightened again as someone gently fed it dried willow sticks. Sparks fluttered upward like tiny spirits escaping to the night. The warmth spread again, touching faces, hands, feet, melting away the ice carried in from outside. At some point, the storm reached its loudest roar, the kind of roar that made the whole world shake. The teepee poles quivered, the hides thudded against the wind, and for a brief moment, it felt as if the earth itself were breathing heavily. But the people inside didn't panic. They had seen this before. Their ancestors had survived worse. Some even smiled, whispering that the storm was testing them, reminding them they were still alive. And still the teepee held. Still the fire burned. Still the people remained warm. Still life continued. But the night wasn't over. Not even close. The storm would grow colder. The fire would burn lower. The world outside would freeze harder. Yet the people inside would continue to live exactly as they had for hundreds of winters, adapting, enduring, thriving. But even as the storm softened for a moment, a new kind of cold settled over the plains, the kind that didn't roar, didn't scream, didn't rage, but crept. A silent cold. A deadly cold. The kind that seeped into bones, slowed breaths, and made time feel heavy. Outside the teepee, the air turned to glass. Inside, every movement felt louder, every breath warmer, every heartbeat clearer. The people could sense the shift long before sunrise. Winter always spoke before it acted, and the native people had learned to listen. The fire sputtered, throwing shadows against the buffalo hide walls that stretched and shrank like moving spirits. A boy awoke with a shiver. Not from fear, but from instinct. He pushed himself closer to the sleeping firs, watching his breath curl upward. His grandmother, still awake, noticed him and gently pulled another robe over his shoulders. She didn't use many words. She didn't need to. In this world, silence carried meaning. A look, a gesture, a breath, everything mattered. Across the teepee, two men were preparing for something few outsiders could imagine, a pre-dawn check of the camp. Even at -30 degrees Celsius, with frost forming on eyelashes and fingertips burning like fire, the men moved with quiet discipline. They wrapped themselves in heavy robes, tightened their belts, adjusted the hoods of their buffalo coats. Their faces were painted with a thin layer of grease to block the wind. Before leaving, one man placed a handful of dried sage into the fire, letting the fragrant smoke rise as a blessing. Another whispered a short prayer in his native tongue, asking the spirits for safe steps. When they pushed aside the hide door and stepped into the black-blue world outside, the cold struck like a physical blow. It hit the chest first, then the eyes, then the fingertips, sharp, direct, alive. Their breaths exploded into white clouds that hung in the air like frozen ghosts. The sky above was pitch dark, but thousands of stars glittered with a clarity only deep winter could create. No wind now. No storm. Just a silence so complete that it almost buzzed in the ears. Snow crunched loudly under their moccasins. Hard snow. Layered snow. The storm had packed it tight. Their footprints barely sank. The entire camp looked like a cluster of dark, rounded mounds buried in white. Every teepee leaned slightly in the same direction, shaped by wind, strengthened by design. Thin trails of smoke curled upward from each smoke hole, glowing faintly orange from the hidden fires inside. But something else caught their attention: the horses. They stood near the windbreaks, but the frost on their backs had thickened. The men moved closer, reaching out gently to touch them. Warm breath puffed from the horses' nostrils, but the cold had stiffened their tails, frosted their eyelashes, and turned their manes into brittle spikes. The men brushed them down with gloved hands, calming them with soft words. Horses were family. They carried the people through storms, hunts, battles. They needed warmth too. So the men cleared snow from around them, checked their legs, and made sure each one was able to move. From somewhere far away, a low sound drifted across the plains, a deep, rolling echo like thunder buried under ice. The men froze, heads tilted. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't wind. It was movement. Heavy movement. Maybe a herd. Maybe predators. Maybe something else. Winter always filled the night with strange sounds, some harmless, some deadly. The men waited, breathing slowly, listening. The sound faded. The silence returned. They exchanged a glance but didn't speak. Speech wasted breath. Breath wasted strength. Back inside the teepee, the dim glow of the fire felt stronger when they re-entered. Warmth wrapped around them like a living blanket. Frost melted from their clothes, rising as soft steam. A woman passed them a bowl of warm broth made from boiled buffalo bones, the kind of broth that restored heat to fingertips and life to tired muscles. The men drank quietly, grateful. Meanwhile, an elder prepared the morning tasks. At this temperature, everything had to be done carefully. Tools cracked easily. Food froze into stone. But the people had solutions for everything. Frozen meat was cut with bone knives warmed over steam. Water was stored in ice form and melted slowly over low heat. Even the children had small roles, arranging furs, bringing small sticks to the fire, or helping dry clothing. A young girl stroked the fur of a dog curled beside her. The animal lifted its head, ears twitching at every distant sound. Dogs were early warning systems. They sensed weather changes before people. They sensed animals. Spirits. Danger. The girl smiled and whispered to it, her voice soft and warm. In this frozen world, companionship was survival. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed outside, not loud, but unmistakable. It sounded like ice splitting under weight. Every adult in the teepee paused. Eyes turned toward the entrance. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. The crack came again, slightly deeper, almost like a footstep on ice-crusted snow. One of the men reached for his spear. Not out of fear, but readiness. Danger didn't always come loudly. Sometimes it crept like a shadow. Minutes passed. Then the sound faded away. The tension eased, but not fully. In winter, caution kept you alive. As dawn approached, the sky shifted to a pale blue-gray. Light seeped into the teepee little by little, illuminating the curved walls and the weaving patterns painted near the top where the smoke escaped. The fire's glow changed, mixing with the cold morning light. The day would begin soon. And with it the work. Hunting. Fetching firewood. Repairing hides. Checking traps. Teaching children. And surviving. Every day was a dance with winter, but never a battle. The native people didn't fight the cold. They negotiated with it. They learned its moods. They respected its strength. And the teepee, this masterpiece of engineering, culture, and survival, was their shield, their home, their identity. As the morning deepened, a soft wind began to rise again. Not a dangerous one, but a reminder. The cold wasn't done. The storm wasn't gone. Winter had many faces, many moods, many trials. But so did the people living inside these cone-shaped homes. They would endure this day. And the next. And the next after that. Because this was not just survival. This was life. Their life. An unbroken chain passed from ancestor to child, from winter to winter, from story to story. And the story wasn't ending yet. The faint light of morning crept across the frozen plains, but the sun itself hid behind thick clouds, refusing to show its face. At -30 degrees Celsius, morning didn't bring warmth, only visibility. The teepee glowed gently as the fire regained strength, and the steam rising from the damp hides gave the impression that the whole structure was breathing out its own warm breath into the icy air. Children stirred in their sleep, stretching small arms and curling toes inside soft fur blankets. Their mothers watched them lovingly, brushing frost from their eyebrows, making sure no cold had found its way through the many layers of skin and cloth. Outside, the snow carried a blue tint under the pale light, and the entire world looked like it had been dipped in ice. The warriors stepped out again, this time spreading across the camp to check the traps set the previous night. Every step they took made a sharp crystalline crunch, an unmistakable sound that only winter could produce. Their breath drifted out in long, slow streams, lingering in the air before gently fading. One of the men paused suddenly, kneeling near a pile of snow shaped strangely. He brushed it aside to reveal a frozen rabbit, caught in one of their snares. The small creature had died quickly, its body already stiff as carved wood. The man whispered a quiet word of thanks. Every life taken was acknowledged. Every animal was owed respect. He wrapped the rabbit in a piece of hide and continued walking. Closer to the tree-line, another man checked a larger trap, this one meant for foxes or wolves. The wind was gentler here, shielded by the trees, but the cold felt sharper as if hiding between the branches. The trap was empty, but tracks circled the area, delicate and clear in the snow. Fox, he thought. Quick, intelligent, watching from somewhere unseen. He smiled slightly, admiring the animal's cleverness, then reset the trap, brushing snow over it to hide it again. Back in the camp, smoke from each teepee rose upward in thin spirals that twisted and danced with the faint breeze. Women prepared for the morning meal, melting snow in pots and adding chunks of frozen meat that softened slowly over the fire. The rich scent filled the teepee, mixing with gentle wood smoke, creating a warmth that food alone couldn't offer. Inside, an elder woman hummed quietly while grinding dried berries with a smooth stone. Her hands moved rhythmically, every gesture practiced through a lifetime. Children watched, fascinated, as she mixed the crushed berries with rendered fat to create small, energy-rich cakes, perfect for long days and bitter cold. These weren't just food, they were fuel, tradition, and memory. All around the camp, people worked with purpose, no frantic movements, no wasted energy. Winter demanded efficiency. Each person had a role, and even the smallest contribution mattered. A young boy carefully repaired a moccasin, threading sinew through tiny holes. Another girl sat by the fire, shaping a small wooden bowl using a stone scraper. Her hands were numb, but she didn't stop. The bowl wasn't for herself, it was for her younger brother who had lost his old one when it cracked in the cold. Acts of care were deeply woven into the fabric of their lives. Farther from the camp, the hunters continued deeper into the forest. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it the faint scent of something alive, something big. They halted instantly. No words. Only breath. One of them knelt and touched the snow. Tracks fresh. Large. Elk. The men exchanged glances, each one reading the thoughts of the others without speaking. Elk were a blessing in winter, but tracking them through deep snow required discipline and patience. Their breaths slowed. Hearts quieted. minds sharpened. They began moving silently through the trees, each step measured. Snow drifted from branches above, landing softly on their shoulders. The forest felt older here, heavier. Birds were silent. Even the wind treaded lightly. After almost an hour of slow movement, they saw it, a massive elk standing near a frozen stream, its thick winter coat shimmering under the pale daylight. Steam rose gently from its nostrils. It didn't know the hunters were there. Not yet. One of the men whispered a prayer in his heart, asking forgiveness for what he was about to do. Life required sacrifice. The earth gave, and in return, the people respected every gift. Back at the camp, an elder sat with a group of children, drawing shapes in the snow with a stick. Not random shapes, constellations. The children leaned closer, their eyes reflecting curiosity and wonder. The elder showed them how stars guided their ancestors, how they told stories of great hunts, great winters, great journeys. Even in daylight, the stories lived. Knowledge had to be passed on constantly, woven into daily life, because winter didn't pause learning. Winter required it. Inside a nearby teepee, a mother repaired a rip in a buffalo robe, her needles sharp and precise. She wasn't just fixing clothing, she was preserving her family's warmth, safety, and comfort. Every stitch was a promise that her children would sleep without shivering. Her hands were cracked from cold, but steady. Her face tired but determined. Strength here was quiet, constant, and loving. Outside, the dogs had begun barking, all facing the same direction. Alert. Focused. Not panicked, but cautious. Something was approaching. The people listened, but the sound was faint, so faint that only the dogs could hear it. A distant movement. Heavy. Slow. The hunters were still in the woods. The warriors at the camp readied their spears discreetly, their faces calm. Danger wasn't unfamiliar. Winter brought hunger, not only for people, but for predators. Wolves, if desperate, could approach. Mountain lions too. Even bears, though rare this season, might leave their dens if starvation demanded it. The sound grew sharper. The camp froze. Every child was pulled close. Every fire quieted. Every voice fell silent. Then, through the fog of cold air, shapes appeared. Not wolves. Not predators. Men. The hunters returning. Dragging the elk behind them. Relief spread like warmth. The dogs barked joyfully. Children cheered. Women rushed forward with blankets to wrap around the hunters' shoulders. The people didn't waste a moment. The elk was placed near the center of the camp, and immediately the butchering began, clean, respectful, efficient. Every part of the animal had a purpose. Nothing wasted. Nothing forgotten. The heart was removed first, held gently, honored with soft words. The hide would become clothing. The bones tools. The meat life. As the day passed, the cold deepened again. Shadows lengthened. Fires grew brighter. The people worked, laughed softly, told stories, taught, learned, and lived. And the teepee, warm, ancient, wise, stood at the center of it all. Strong against the wind. Warm against the cold. Alive in the frozen world. The night would come again. The temperature would fall again. Winter would test them again. But the people were ready. They had always been ready. Because this was not simply a way of surviving. This was a way of being. As the elk was cleaned and divided with skill passed down for generations, the sky slowly darkened again, the pale winter light fading into a deep indigo. But evening didn't frighten anyone. Night and cold were familiar companions, sometimes harsh, sometimes gentle. The people understood both sides. As the first stars blinked to life, the air grew even sharper, the cold turning thin as glass, slicing quietly through anything unprotected. Inside the teepees, fires glowed warmly, each flame a moving heart within the breathing shelters. The dogs curled near entrances, their bodies forming living barriers against drafts. The hunters, tired but proud, removed their heavy garments, steam rising from their backs as the warmth inside wrapped around them. Their faces were flushed from the effort of dragging the elk through deep snow, and when the elders handed them bowls of hot broth, they accepted with grateful eyes and exhausted smiles. Outside, the camp shimmered under the starlight. The snow reflected the moonless sky, creating a ghostly glow that looked almost unnatural. Light didn't come from the heavens tonight. It came from the fire. From the people. From the warmth inside the teepees. A faint, swirling mist rose around the camp as warm air escaped into the frigid darkness before disappearing like breath from a spirit. A young boy, full of energy despite the cold, helped carry bundles of firewood from one teepee to another. His tiny hands were wrapped in fur mittens, his cheeks rosy from the sting of winter. Each time he entered a teepee, he soaked in the warm air, sighed happily, then ran out again into the icy world. He wanted to help. He wanted to be useful. Others smiled softly at him, remembering when they too were children delivering small gifts of warmth to their families. As darkness deepened, women gathered inside one of the larger teepees, preparing hides for the upcoming nights. They worked by firelight, their shadows jumping across the walls, growing and shrinking with each flicker. One woman sang softly under her breath, an old song, older than anyone in the teepee. Her voice was gentle, steady, carrying a melody shaped by thousands of winters. The children nearby listened without realizing they were learning something ancient, something that would live in them long after these nights had passed. By now, the cold outside had sharpened into something almost metallic. The kind of cold that froze hair solid within minutes. The kind that turned water to ice before it reached the ground. The kind that demanded respect. But the people were prepared. They tightened the smoke flaps of the teepees, placed heavier hides along the base, and added extra wood to each fire. The elder who taught constellations earlier sat with a small group of young teens, telling a winter tale, the story of a great hunter who once followed a massive buffalo through a blizzard so fierce that the world turned white for days. The hunter had no fire, no shelter, only instinct and courage. The teens leaned in, eyes bright, their imaginations painting images of howling storms and drifting beasts. The elder's voice grew deeper as he described how the hunter survived by listening, not with ears, but with the heart. By feeling the ground. By watching the snow. By trusting nature instead of fighting it. When he finished, silence filled the teepee, a silence filled with thought. Meanwhile, the warriors outside scanned the horizon, their eyes adjusting to the darkness. They listened for the slightest movement, the faintest crunch of snow. Winter nights were unpredictable. Storms could return without warning. Predators could wander close. But the camp felt peaceful tonight, wrapped in its own circle of light and warmth. The stars above seemed to dance slowly, shimmering as if alive. Suddenly, a soft howl echoed across the distant plains. Not threatening, just a wild call, long and mournful. Wolves. A pack. The sound drifted on the wind, rising and falling like a song. Children inside the teepees looked up, wide-eyed. They weren't afraid. They had grown up with wolves. They knew the difference between a hungry call and a territorial one. The howl tonight was simply a reminder that the world was vast, shared by many, and that life moved through cold and snow with its own rhythm. The warriors exchanged nods. No danger. Still, they reinforced the windbreaks, checked the perimeter, and tightened their robes. Winter respected the prepared. As the night deepened, the moon finally crept out from behind a veil of clouds, pale, huge, glowing with a cold fire of its own. It illuminated the teepees, turning them into glowing shapes of gold and white. Steam rose from the tops like gentle spirits. Snow sparkled with crystals. The world looked almost unreal, like a memory of something ancient. Inside one teepee, a mother nursed her baby, rocking gently as the fire warmed their faces. The infant's tiny fingers curled around the mother's necklace, a simple string with a single carved bead. The mother whispered soothing words, her breath warm against the baby's forehead. She knew winter was harsh, but she also knew her people had survived thousands of such winters. Her child would too. Across the camp, Two elderly men sat with their heads bowed over a small bowl of smoldering sage. They prayed quietly, their words drifting upward with the faint smoke, blending into the air like soft threads of gratitude. They thanked the earth for the elk. They thanked the ancestors for knowledge. They thanked the winter for teaching strength, patience, and humility. Though the cold pressed hard against the world outside, inside the teepee's life pulsed with warmth. Conversations flowed softly. Children laughed. Dogs stretched lazily. Fire popped and crackled. Everything felt balanced, whole, secure. Until a sudden gust of wind swept across the plains. It came fast. It came strong. It came with the unmistakable voice of a new storm. The dogs leapt to their feet. The warriors turned instantly. The wind howled again, louder, sharper, carrying with it powdery snow that blew in swirling arcs. The storm had returned. Not a gentle one. A fierce one. The kind that tested everything and everyone. Inside the teepees, mothers pulled children close. Men secured their weapons. Elders moved closer to the fire. The walls shook under the sudden pressure of the wind. Snow hammered the hides, scraping and sliding with a harsh hiss. The air grew colder by the second. But no one panicked. Not even for a heartbeat. They had been through this before. They knew what to do. The fires roared brighter. The hides tightened against the poles. The people drew closer together. And the storm screamed louder outside. Testing them. Challenging them. But the teepee stood strong. And the people sat tall. Because winter could roar all it wanted. They knew how to answer. The storm slammed into the camp with a force that felt almost alive, as if some ancient winter spirit had awakened and decided to test the strength of the people once more. The wind screamed across the plains, dragging long trails of snow like ghosts running low to the ground. The teepees shuddered under the impact, their hides tightening and loosening in rhythm with the gusts, but their structure, perfect, aerodynamic, ancient, held firm. Inside, the people moved with calm preparation. Fires were fed constantly. Extra hides layered the coldest corners. Children were wrapped like small bundles of fur, placed between parents and elders so no warmth would escape their tiny bodies. Dogs, usually restless, curled tightly near the entrances, their ears twitching at every thundering blast outside. The storm grew harsher still. One gust tore through the camp with such force that it felt like the air itself cracked. Snow burst through small gaps in some teepees, swirling briefly inside before melting near the flames. Mothers brushed the flakes away from their children's faces, whispering soft words that blended with the roar of the wind. Even through the chaos, their voices remained steady, voices strengthened by countless winters before this one. In one teepee, a young man checked the hides repeatedly, using his shoulder to push the poles tighter into the frozen ground. His breath came out heavy and white, sweat forming on his forehead despite the freezing air. Behind him, an elder watched silently, his eyes calm, approving. The young man's movements were strong, precise, respectful. The teepee was not just shelter, it was a living thing to be protected. Outside, visibility dropped to almost nothing. The world turned white, completely, overwhelmingly white. Snow blew sideways, upward, downward, in circles, in waves. Even the stars disappeared, swallowed by the storm. The moon vanished behind a wall of swirling ice. It was the kind of storm that could erase trails, erase landmarks, erase entire memories of daylight. But the people listened through the storm. Listening was survival. The wind had a voice, and they knew its language. Sometimes it warned. Sometimes it threatened. Sometimes it simply passed through. Tonight, its voice was a challenge, loud, raw, fierce, ancient. Inside the hunter's teepee, the men gathered close to the fire. They spoke with low voices, their words careful, measured. One of them described how the elk's tracks had been nearly buried already, even though the animal had been dragged back only hours ago. Another spoke about the wind's shift. It wasn't just fierce, it carried something unusual. A smell. A distant echo. Maybe a herd moving. Maybe wolves following the scent of the butchered elk. Maybe the storm masking something larger. No one dismissed the possibility. Winter always carried more than one danger. A sudden thump hit the side of the teepee. Not a gust. Not snow. Something heavier. Everyone froze for a heartbeat. Then came another thump, closer to the ground, slow, dragging. The dogs outside barked sharply. The men reached for their spears. Not panic, just readiness. One of the warriors crawled toward the door, lifting the hide just enough to peek out. Snow blew in immediately, slashing across the firelight. He squinted, letting his eyes adjust, trying to shape the blurry movement outside into something recognizable. A dark shape moved just beyond the circle of campfires. Slow. Low. Silent. Another shape followed it. The warrior's heart tightened, not in fear but focus. Wolves. A small pack. Not attacking, but searching. Curious. Drawn by scent. The other men quietly stood, forming a semicircle behind the warrior. They didn't step outside, not in this storm. Visibility was too poor, footing too dangerous. But they were prepared. Wolves rarely attacked a full camp, especially during a storm this fierce. But hunger made any creature unpredictable. The shapes lingered, pacing, moving between swirling snow walls. The storm hid them, revealed them, hid them again. Eyes flashed once, bright and reflective, then disappeared into the white chaos. Minutes passed. Slowly, the dogs' barking softened. The shapes drifted away. Danger passed, but never fully gone. The warrior let the hide fall back into place, the warmth of the fire meeting his frozen cheeks. He dusted snow from his shoulders, nodding to the others without speaking. They returned to their seats, but no one relaxed completely. Winter nights demanded vigilance. Meanwhile, in another teepee, a grandmother told a story to a group of children huddled against her sides. The storm outside didn't frighten her. She had lived through storms far worse. Her voice flowed like smoke from the fire, soft but strong. She spoke of a time long ago when the people followed the great buffalo herds across the plains. She told them how teepees were first created, not by guessing, but by watching nature. How the cone shape came from watching the snowdrifts around tall trees. How the hides were layered after observing how animals shed and thickened their fur. How everything they built wasn't invention, but cooperation with the world around them. The children listened wide-eyed, forgetting the storm outside. The grandmother continued, her voice steady even as the wind screamed around the teepee walls. She spoke of ancestors walking through storms that lasted days, sometimes weeks, driven only by their trust in the land. Of hunters who followed stars even when clouds hid them. Of mothers who kept their children warm through winters that shattered trees with cold. The eldest child in the group leaned closer to the fire, mesmerized by the flickering glow. Stories were more than stories, they were guides. The children absorbed every word, storing them deep inside like embers waiting to ignite when needed. Outside, the storm intensified yet again. Snow piled high around the base of the teepees, rising inch by inch. The hides hummed under the wind's pressure. Wooden poles creaked, but none broke. The engineering of the teepee, its sacred geometry, allowed it to bend, to sway, to survive. Hours passed. Fires were fed again. Children slept. Elders dozed lightly. Dogs guarded. And the people endured. Because endurance was who they were. They didn't conquer winter. They danced with it. And even in the wildest storm, the world outside could never break the warmth inside. Not tonight. Not ever. The storm roared. But the people remained unshaken. The cold roared like a living creature that night, pushing against the teepee walls as if it wanted to tear its way inside. But the people inside moved with a kind of calm rhythm that came only from generations of surviving winters far worse than this one. The crackling of the central fire painted the inner hides with shifting orange waves, and the air smelled of smoke, pine tar, and fresh snow melting on warm stones. Children huddled under robes, their breath turning into little clouds that drifted toward the teepee's smoke hole. Outside, the wind howled like a hungry spirit, but inside there was a sense of steadiness, a living heartbeat made of fire, hides, and human presence. Even when temperatures fell to minus 30 degrees Celsius, the people didn't panic, because they understood winter, not as an enemy, but as a powerful teacher. Grandmothers often said that winter tested the weak parts of the mind before it tested the body. That's why stories were told during the coldest nights. A story could warm the heart when the fire struggled to warm the hands. And on that night, as frost formed lace along the base of the teepee, an elder began speaking, his voice low like rumbling earth, shaping words that carried from winter to winter. He told the children that every teepee had its own soul. The 15 poles rising from the ground were like ribs of a giant animal, and the hide wrapping was its skin. When the people slept, the teepee kept watch. When storms screamed, the teepee planted its shoulders against the wind. And when travelers returned half-frozen, the teepee opened its warm belly to shelter them. The children listened, eyes wide, believing every word, because they could feel the teepee breathing with the wind. Sometimes the poles creaked softly, almost like they were dreaming. Outside, snowdrifts stacked higher and higher, burying the world in white. The dogs curled against one another, their fur turning icy at the tips. The buffalo hide door of the teepee shook with every gust. To survive nights like this, the people had their own rituals. Before sleeping, they placed warm stones under robes, keeping the cold from creeping into their bones. They checked the smoke flaps repeatedly to make sure the wind didn't force smoke back down into the living space. They tightened the base of the teepee so heat wouldn't leak out. Everything was done with precision born from generations of practice. But survival wasn't just preparation, it was understanding nature itself. The people knew how snow behaved. They knew that a wall of snow pressed against the base of the teepee actually acted as insulation, trapping warmth inside. So they welcomed certain drifts instead of shoveling them away. They also knew how to read the sounds of winter, the way the wind shifted tones before a new storm arrived, the way trees popped when their sap froze too fast, the soft crackle that warned when snowflakes were turning into ice. The world was a teacher, and winter was the strictest of all. Somewhere in the night, the fire died down to glowing embers, but even then the teepee held warmth. A faint heat shimmered along the inner hides. Outside, the stars glittered like shards of bones scattered across the sky. Hunters who kept watch could feel the snow crunch under their moccasins, a sound sharp enough to echo. Their eyelashes froze together, and frost clung to the tips of their braids. But they walked patiently, circling camp, checking tracks, watching for wolves driven closer by hunger. For them, minus 30 degrees Celsius was not just a number, it was a challenge woven into their identity. Inside the teepee, a mother fed a baby by drawing warm milk into a horn spoon, keeping the child close to her body so he wouldn't lose heat. A father carved a snowshoe frame, letting the fire harden the wood. A grandmother stitched a new pair of moccasins using sinew that had been dried and softened until it was strong as leather but flexible as thread. Everything done inside the teepee served survival. Nothing was wasted. Scraps of hide became patches, leftover bones became needles, broken wood became fire kindling. The teepee itself taught efficiency. Hours passed. The storm outside deepened, swirling snow in a frenzy that erased the horizon. It was the kind of night where breath froze before it left the mouth, where the air felt like it was slicing through layers of fur. But inside, despite the occasional shiver, despite the moans of the wind, there was warmth. There was life. There was the soft sound of a family breathing together. As the night pushed toward dawn, the elders began their morning preparations early, knowing winter did not wait for anyone. They stoked the fire, added fresh logs, and placed stones around the flames to heat for later. Someone brushed snow from the inner walls. Another stirred a pot of dried berries and powdered meat, making a kind of early stew. Children wrapped themselves tighter in blankets made from rabbit fur. Every movement, every sound, every task was part of a rhythm older than memory. When first light finally broke through the storm, dim, blue, and trembling, the world outside the teepee looked transformed. Snow had swallowed the landscape in white silence. Trees bowed under heavy frost. The camp seemed carved from ice. But smoke rose from every teepee, curling upward like whispered prayers. Even in the harshest cold the people lived, breathed, worked, laughed, cooked, told stories, prepared hunts, cared for elders, and watched over the young. Warmth existed, not because winter was kind, but because the people refused to let winter conquer them. And this was how Native Americans built and lived in teepees during -30°C winters, not with fear, but with knowledge passed from ancestor to ancestor, with craftsmanship honed by generations, with a deep respect for the land, and with a spirit that refused to break under the weight of the coldest nights. Their survival was not an accident. It was a masterpiece.